So, like I said, chapter 18, section 1 notes. We're talking about the beginnings of basically the French Revolution. We're going to get into a lot of different people that maybe you've heard of their names before. Yesterday I brought up Napoleon. At some point we'll get into him. But we're talking about today the background to the revolution, kind of what led to it, all right? If I were to ask you what you think would lead to a revolution, what do you think would lead to a revolution in a society? Go ahead.
If not only the people were really upset with how the place was being ruled or controlled, but if there was enough of them who weren't just upset but were willing to do something / die for the cause.
Okay, yeah, so a lot of people being upset with something, with the way that the place is being ruled, but also not just a lot of people being upset, but people that are willing to actually do something. That's true. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a huge disagreement that like a lot of people are on both sides and they really are like strong about their opinion.
Okay, so obviously being strong about our opinions. I would also go a step further. There's got to be some key things that they're probably going to be upset about, right? Like they're not going to be upset about one or two laws, right? You're probably going to be dealing with maybe people not eating, maybe people not having housing. When basic needs tend to not be getting met in a society, in a culture, that is where you really start to see uprisings. That is where you really start to see people getting very frustrated. When there's a lot of social injustice, that is where you start to see people getting very frustrated. We have seen this in our culture over the past year, 2-3 years, right? And it's been coming to a head. So we start to see this. Am I saying there's going to be a revolution in our country? No, not necessarily. But that is what you start to see. And if things aren't dealt with, if people aren't helped, if needs aren't being met, you start to see larger groups of people forming around those issues, and then we see revolt. So let's see what was happening in France. So French Revolution began in 1789. It was more complex, more violent, and more radical than the American Revolution. It tried to create both a new political order and social order. The immediate causes of the French Revolution were, underline, economic problems at the time, but there were also large range problems that created an environment for revolution. Before the revolution, French society was based on inequality. Underline that. Society was based on inequality. France was divided into three. Go ahead. What was that, Antonio?
May I use the bathroom?
Yeah, go ahead, buddy. Yep. So, French society based on it. France was divided into three orders or estates. 3 orders or estates. You're going to want to know them. There's some, as you're going through the notes packet, you'll see boxes that you'll fill in at one point. But the first estate consisted of the clergy. All right? The clergy. So that's the people who worked for the church. Okay? There were about 130,000 people in the first estate. They owned about 10% of the land, and they were exempt from what was called the tally, which is the main tax of France. So 130,000 people working for the church, they didn't have to pay a main tax. This is going to be important. You'll hear in a second why. The second estate was the nobility. That's about 350,000 people. All right, so you're up to about what? About 500,000 people, give or take. They owned about 25 to 30% of the land, and they held many of the leading positions in government, military, courts, higher church offices. They were also exempt from the tally, which is the main tax of France. So we see two pretty large groups of people, not ridiculously large, but pretty, let's say, the elitists of the society, if you will, not having to pay what? Tax, or the main tax. Not all taxes, but the main tax. Do you think that's going to get on some people's nerves? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. Do we have people in our country that don't pay taxes? Some don't. Churches are exempt, right? If you didn't know that, now you do. So some churches bring in millions upon millions upon millions of dollars and don't pay a tax. Now, I'm not saying that they should tax them, that they shouldn't tax them, but there's a logic to why people might get upset about that. When I make, I make under $100,000 a year, and I get taxed pretty significantly. But if I worked for a church and I owned a multi-million-dollar building that was bringing in millions upon millions of dollars a year, now not all churches do this, understand that, but it's exempt. I could have 3 jets, not have to pay for them, tax-wise. Do you understand? I'd have to pay for them to buy them, but I wouldn't have to pay taxes on those jets every year. My properties, if I labeled them under the church, I don't have to pay for them. Again, am I saying that's bad, wrong? No, I'm just saying you can understand why people might get upset about that. Okay? That is what you're seeing in this country, in France at the time. The third estate consisted of the commoners. All right, the commoners. This was the majority of the French population, and this estate was further divided by occupations, wealth. We see this in our country, right? We might not call it like the estates, but we have a class system, right? Upper class, middle class, lower class. That's been divided and divided and divided into upper class, upper middle class, upper lower class, upper. There's about 37 million classes if you really wanted to break it down, but it is based on our what? Money, the amount of money that we bring in each year, right? Most of us would be considered middle class, all right? Middle upper or middle lower, but we tend to be in the middle class. But there are elite upper and there are very low, right, in our culture. A lot of people have tried to lessen that gap over the years, especially in our culture. It has not really worked. If you were to ask me my opinion, I think we see a lot more of it getting wider over times. You have the haves and you have the have-nots. You're getting to a point where it's becoming never had, never will have, but always had, and we're kind of at odds with one another. Like even the middle class that's supposed to kind of hold those two groups together are being stretched so much that they're losing ground, they're not gaining. Whereas as you grow up in our culture, growing up, I'm 44 now, I remember always thinking, I could always, move up in classes. I could always raise myself. It's getting very difficult to do that. Can that be fixed? Hopefully. I mean, I'm not an economy kind of guy. I don't have that brain, but we'll see what happens over time. But I have felt that stretch over the years. The dollar doesn't go as far. Your paycheck can't stretch as far. Those kind of things come in. And we're seeing that here in France at the time. The peasants were the largest segment of the third estate. They were about 75 to 80% of the total population. So that's a lot of poor people. That's not the way it is in our country. We don't have that amount of that you would, define in the poor category. But like I just said, it's getting larger. So 75 to 80% of was this group, a lot of poor. As a group, they owned 35 to 40% of the land, not a ton, but over half of them had little or no land on which to survive. This is interesting. Underline this. Serfdom had largely been eliminated, but French peasants still had obligations to their landlords. So they still owed them money off of their land or part of their farming off of the land. Okay, so they weren't really owning any land. They were basically borrowing or renting land, okay? But the French peasants still had obligations. These were called relics of feudalism. Relics of feudalism, or aristocratic privileges. These were obligations that survived from an earlier age. The peasants deeply resented these. They included fees to use village facilities, such as the flour mill, community ovens, wine press. Another part of the third estate consisted of skilled crafts people, shoe keepers, wage earners in the cities. A rise in consumer prices that was greater than the increase in wages made it difficult for these urban people to survive. This struggle for survival led many people to play an important role in the revolution. The bourgeoisie, you can underline, or middle class, was another part of the third estate. This was about 8% of the population, about 2.3 million people. They owned 20 to 25% of the land. This group included what you would think about today in our culture, middle to upper class, merchants, bankers, industrial, doctors, lawyers, writers. Members of the middle class were unhappy with the privileges of the nobility. At the same time, they still had a great deal involved with the nobility. It would be like me being upset with a really rich doctor, but yet I have a car, 2 cars, I have a home, I eat every night. I'm not in real want. Do you understand? That's kind of this concept. But I really want that more stuff. And that's kind of where they started getting upset. By obtaining public offices, wealthy middle-class people could become part of the nobility. Members of nobility and the bourgeoisie were both influenced by the new ideas of the Enlightenment. We talked about those way earlier in the year, right? Everybody can think for themselves and do for themselves. Many of the people in these groups opposed the monarchy. All right, of course they would oppose the monarchy because the monarchy had carte blanche. They could do whatever they wanted, and these people thought what about themselves? No, we can do whatever we want. We're right-thinking people. We can do what we want to do and do well at that. The social inequality in France created the background for the French Revolution, but the immediate cause of the revolution was the near collapse of government finances. That is very important. Underline that. Bad harvests and a slowdown in manufacturing led to food shortages, rising prices for food, and unemployment in cities. The number of poor reached crisis proportions. At the same time, the French government continued to spend enormous amounts of money on wars and luxuries. So think about that. We don't have money, but what are we still doing? Still spending it. We're still spending it. All right, the Queen Marie Antoinette, you might have heard her name before, was known for her extravagance. On the verge of a complete financial collapse, the government of Louis XVI was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General. That's kind of like their Congress, in essence, okay? This was the French Parliament, and it had not met since 1614. So kind of a comparison to today's society, where we're at, right? We see utter poverty coming into play, which we do see happening in our country. A lot of poor, a lot of poverty coming around in our country. We see prices rising. We see that in our country. You might hear people talking about the $15 minimum wage, and not everybody has a living wage, and all these concepts of trying to help money. And then we see governments doing what over the past year? What has our government done over the past year? They just did it a third time. What did they pass? A stimulus package, which is trillions of dollars. Now, did you hear me say that it's a bad thing? No. Do people need help? Yes. Do all people need all of that help? Not necessarily. Again, I'm not in those positions, so I'm not necessarily saying they're bad. But what led to this revolution back in France was just a collapse financially and poverty rising. And the government doing what? Spend. That money has to come from somewhere. Do you understand that? So if the government is just going to throw money at things, again, do things need money thrown at them? Of course they do. But when you're spending trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions, this last one was just what? Just under 2 trillion. It was 1.9 trillion, right? That's not including the other 2 that already happened. You're now talking about an exorbitant amount of money that how do you pay it back? You ever hear the old saying, the bill will come due? Right? At some point, if I order a lot of food when I'm out to eat, guess what happens? Somebody brings me what at the end of my meal? The check. The bill comes due. I got to be able to do what? I got to be able to pay it. If I can't pay that bill, I'm in serious trouble. So go ahead.
Like, this is going to sound incredibly stupid.
No, it won't.
Why can't everyone just, like, if the problem is money, why can't we just make more?
Okay, that's not a dumb question. That's a good question. There's this concept called, what she said, if you couldn't hear out there, was if everybody needs money, why can't we just keep making more, right? Why can't we just keep printing money? Does anybody have an answer to that out there? Go ahead, I see a hand up. I forget who that, I can't see. Talk, go ahead. Who is that? Let me see who that, Will, it's Will. Go ahead, Will.
So the problem with inflation is if you print more money, then the money you already have becomes less and less valued. The worth of it goes down because there's just more of it.
Exactly.
So in terms, you're not helping anything.
Right. So the concept is very simple, and he explained it very well. If I have money used to be backed by precious metals, gold, silver, right? It no longer is. It's now backed by the name on the bill, which is the United States of America. If I continuously print paper, what does that become? Paper. It's worthless because there's nothing really backing it. So if I have less of it, it has more value. The more I print of it, that's a very simple way of understanding inflation. So now a roll of toilet paper that used to cost you $2 will now cost you $8,000 because we've just printed $900 million. Do you understand what I'm saying? Go ahead, go.
Didn't this happen in some country? It was like Venezuela.
It happens in almost every country that decides that it wants to try to be, you'll hear this spoken of in very angry terms sometimes, socialist, where the government is controlling everything and the government is giving enough money to everybody to be able to live. And it tends to not work. It tends to crumble very quickly when that happens. Where if I keep incentivizing giving you money to survive, what's going to end up happening? The money's going to have no value, everything's going to cost a lot, and you're still not going to be able to make it. And the government will eventually collapse. That's what ends up happening. Was your hand up, or were you just messing with your... Okay, go ahead.
I meant more like as a whole.
What do you mean?
As like a world, why can't everyone like there be a huge meeting and everyone decide, okay, this isn't working, there's way too many poor people in all of our countries.
Okay.
We need to find like a new system of making it so that people can live like, kinda like that.
Okay. Well, another good question, and I'll try to keep it as very simple as possible for my own brain to understand. We all operate on a different form of money. That's part of it, right? We all operate on different forms of government too. So where China is under a communist government, all right, America is under a democracy government, it would be very difficult for us to institute rules the way they would and the way that we would. So a lot of people have argued for a one world money. That's been an argument for years. There's also been talks of a one world government. You're getting into probably what you would be looking at as World War III, if that were the type of... Again, I'm trying to keep it as very minimalistic as to kind of wrap your brain around. Would China want to give up... They're a very powerful country, right? United States is a very powerful country, right? Would either of us want to give up our power? I don't think any country is going to be like, sure, you take over. Like, it's going to be this like butting of heads. So it'd be very difficult. The world has tried at times to come together to help the concept of poor. An issue that the world says that they're all fighting together on is global change. It was global warming, but now it's called climate change, right? They've changed the title to kind of fit the mold of what they're trying to fix, right? So doesn't the whole world try to fix that? They've all had meetings on it. Has it gotten fixed? It hasn't changed really one iota. I mean, again, that's not me debating with somebody whether they believe in climate change or not, or whether they agree with climate. I'm not arguing that or debating that. I'm saying you've had a lot of brains from all over the world, different countries, come together thinking, yes, we need to fix this. And have they done anything that has really changed any trajectory of what the climate change is doing? The answer is a resounding no. That's from studies. That's not me just saying that. There are studies that show nothing has really changed. No matter what, if we're all on wind power or solar power, if we're all on oil, if we're all on it, nothing has changed. So getting everyone involved, the old adage of too many hands in the cookie jar, too many, chiefs, not enough Indians, there's all those sayings. When you have too many people that think they know what they're doing, usually guess what gets done? Nothing. A lot of people talking about what they're going to do, and guess what happens? Nothing. So that's kind of the argument. All right? So I'm going to stop this video real quick because we've been going